crucial equation. Without private markets, there's no calculation to coordinate courses, allocate resources, incentivize choices, because it lacks prices. What crop should I grow? Should this factory go? Should I pick a JO? How would your planners ever know?
Socialism means an economic system where you're going to abolish private property in the major factors of production and replace it with some form of collective ownership. In practice, for anything that's a large society, that means de facto government ownership and control of the means of production. Ludwig von Mises launched what became known as the Socialist calculation debate by publishing an article in 1920 called Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. And in it, he says, let's assume the best of intentions of the planners. Let's assume the best efforts from the workers, new socialist man, which, by the way, that guy never showed up to work. But in any event, he says, assume new socialist man who will work for the common good. Then he asks, how is this system going to calculate to figure out how to produce different things?
So Mises starts his monograph, Economic Calculation in a Socialist Commonwealth, by saying the communists have talked about all of these great things, and then they basically assume that roast chickens will somehow fly into the mouths of comrades, and he says they've never actually stepped back to discuss how will this take place. He says we need markets, we need private property in consumer goods, we need private property in the means of production and producer goods to be able to decide whether something makes sense to produce.
If you don't have private ownership of the means of production, you can't have a market for the means of production. Without a market for the means of production, you don't generate prices for them. Without prices, you don't have a relative scarcity indicator, which means we have no idea which inputs to use in which production processes for what products. Thus, even with best of intentions, a socialist system isn't going to be able to plan because it's not going to be able to calculate how to make stuff. So the socialist calculation problem stems from two facts of life. And excuse me, I'm going to be an economics dork here for a minute. Capital's heterogeneous. That means it's not all the same. Each piece of capital is unique. A beer barrel is not a blast furnace. But each piece of capital is also multi-specific. It can be used, that's the other big economics word in there, it can be used in multiple lines of production. Because each piece is different, they can't substitute for each other perfectly, but because they can go into different lines of production, they can substitute at different ratios and different things. Now we've got to figure out their relative scarcity in all of these alternative uses. That's the economic calculation problem. And under capitalism, we solve this by having entrepreneurs bid on these resources, each one of them who has their own goal of what they want to make, and they have their subjective expectation of the value they can create with it. And because they have to bid it away from other capitalists, they have to take account of the subjective valuations that everybody else thinks that they could use that product for too. And absent this bidding in the market, you never reveal what the actual scarcity of these things is. And that's what socialism does, is it gets rid of the market that lets us discover the value of capital in alternative uses. Most of you watching probably have a gas grill that you grill with at home. I'm willing to bet it's not made out of titanium. Now, titanium would be an excellent metal for it, but why don't we use it in gas grills? Well, because titanium is really valuable in other uses for much more high-tech projects that need a much stronger type of metal than your grill needs. As a result, the price of titanium is such that entrepreneurs who make grills say, it's not going to create enough value for them grilling for me to buy this titanium and make a grill. I should leave it there for somebody else to use it in aircraft or what other industry wants to use it.
So we've got a consumer product, the thing that we ultimately eat or consume, and we've got all of the ingredients. He says you need a market in the consumer product, this meal. The consumer needs to be putting their money where their mouth is and saying, this is what I want. At the same time, we also need a market in the ingredients, the producer goods, the capital goods. We need to say, should this ingredient go to that restaurant or to that restaurant, or should we use it to feed farm animals? Each ingredient could go to a multitude of uses, and what markets allow, markets in ingredients, or in this case capital goods, allow is all of the ultimate producers to bid up the price of these resources. And he says that with this, we can now look at what are the costs of producing a product. What are the ultimate values that consumers are willing to pay? And then we can compare this. If consumers are willing to pay more for resources to be used for a particular item, a particular meal, then that's good. If, on the other hand, a restaurant spends all these resources, transforms these resources into something that's bad, that consumers don't want, the market says, don't do that. Stop. You're making losses. You're destroying value. So we need prices in consumer goods. We need prices in producer goods. And that helps determine what should be produced. That helps us engage in rational economic calculation. In an abstract sense, most economists would accept that argument, that you need prices and you can't just get rid of things. Even in the Soviet Union, when they started, or in the early days, trying to get rid of money, they're like, oh, nope, sorry, we can't do this. So they started backtracking and saying, okay, we're going to have prices.
Of course, real-world socialism, the Soviet Union existed for more than 70 years. They found ways to kind of calculate. It was imperfect. They could look at the global market and see, what's the global price of steel? That gives you some idea. Now, is that the same as what the scarcity in the Soviet Union was? No, but it means they weren't completely blind. They could also look at the black market prices in their own economy and use those as an indicator of relative scarcity. Is it perfect? No, a black market's not the same as a legal one, but it gave them some idea. If the whole world actually went socialist, would be utterly blind and production would completely collapse.
Without the price system, Trotsky had a great line. He said, in the Soviet Union, without a price system, the factories resembled telephones whose lines had been cut. So factories in a market system are always communicating with the market by looking at prices of inputs and prices that they can sell their output at. But these factories in the socialist Commonwealth were not going to be communicating with anybody. They were just going to be given directives and told what to produce in what quantities. They seem to think that, well, the plant managers manage production. They'll continue to manage production under socialism without realizing that the important thing about capitalism is how new methods of production come into existence, how there's a competition among entrepreneurs to find the most efficient ways to produce given products, how to introduce new products. Otherwise, at best, we're just repeating the ways of producing things that the socialist economy inherited on the day of the revolution from the old capitalist economy.
We have what we need to throw the chains off us, organize the economy like the post office.
I've seen this personally. The first time I went to Argentina in the 1980s, 2/3 of the cars on the street were 1963 model Ford Falcons. And I was astounded by this. Why is this? Well, because the Argentine government nationalized the Ford factory, and they just hadn't changed the body style since then. Right? In 25 years, they were still churning out 1963 Ford Falcons. So that's your model of socialism. There is production, but it's very wasteful, very archaic, very obsolete production methods. There's no way of updating them. There's no strong tendency for obsolete methods to be cleared out by people who know how to produce things more efficiently, bring in new products and produce them with new methods.
In conjunction with this, also in the 1920s and 30s, Mises had done an additional critique. Well, if socialism doesn't work, maybe an interventionist or regulated economy is sort of a middle ground. So in the 20s and 30s, Mises writes a series of essays challenging this as well. It is true that government regulation, government interventions are not as severe or as comprehensive as a full socialist planned economy. But they're similar to throwing sand in the gears of the machines. The prices are not left to be adaptable and flexible to the dynamics of ever-changing supply and demand on a daily basis. The regulations hamper the businessman, the entrepreneur's own personal judgment, where he's risking his own money and therefore has a motive to try to get it as right as he can. to best estimate what is it consumers want, and what varieties, qualities, and characteristics, and at what prices they may be willing to pay. And therefore, all of this misdirects and prevents the dynamic, constant rebalancing of markets in as efficient a dynamic way as if the government did not get involved. And he argued that the worst of all, of course, is price controls, because then prices are not allowed to speak to people to tell them what to do. And in our today's society, we see this, right? California is about to pass legislation, or has passed legislation, on price controls over rental housing, right? Rent controls. We have many states and municipal governments who are fixing even higher minimum wages, $15 or more an hour. All of these are preventing prices from doing their job, telling businessmen what consumers want, telling employees what their value is worth in alternative employment, to bring about balance and coordination in a dynamic, ever-changing market. It introduces rigidity, stagnation, and inefficiency.
So people basically accepted in the abstract Mises' argument. But still, to this day, there are people who don't think about the world in this way. And they start coming up with all of these proposals and say, hey, I've got some great stuff. How about everybody has all this great stuff? It's going to be given out for free to everybody.
Our healthcare, finance, and industry, let's collectivize and set ourselves free!
And the economist comes along and says, wait, what are you talking about? Where's this going to come from? Who's going to pay for this? Why are we doing that and not that? And the other person who doesn't study economics says, well, it's going to be free, man. Like, it's free. Like, what's the part about free you don't understand? And the economist says, no, you need to look at the opportunity cost. Because if you're giving one thing free over here, you're not giving something free over there. Economics studies how we have unlimited wants and limited means to fill those wants, and we have to allocate things. We have to decide what we're going to be focusing on. So, if we don't have private property, we don't have markets. If we don't have markets, we don't have real prices. If we don't have real prices, we are completely in the dark, deciding how to do things, what to do, where, when, for whom. Mises argues that without markets, without prices, without private property, economic calculation is impossible.